Hello, I'm here to read some more horror books. I just made a video reading horror books, but I promised to read Severance and Bunny, which I didn't get to because The Shards by Bret Easton Ellis completely ruined my life in a great way. I loved it. It's such an unforgettable book. I think it's going to be one of my favorite books of this year, but I needed time. I needed a break. I needed to end the video there. This time, I promise you, I'm going to read Bunny and Severance, and I'm also going to read 2 more books. I have 4 books for you. Can you believe that? The other one is You Will Love What You Have Killed by Kevin Lambert, that's translated from French, and then My Annihilation by Fuminori Nakamura, which I think is translated from Japanese. I'm excited for all of these, but perhaps the most excited for the one that I have started with, which is Severance by Ling. Maybe it wasn't a good choice to start with the one that I want to read the most, because it's probably just going to be downhill from here, but that might not be the case. I think this will be the favorite, though. I'm pretty sure this will be the favorite. Let's talk about it. I'm halfway through. Do you think there's a blurb on the back of this that's J. Robert Lennon? Do you think he's shortened it to J because his name is John? His name's John Lennon? I'm looking it up. His parents named him after John Lennon, and he's embarrassed about it. So he goes by J. Robert Lennon. Who is this man? John Robert Lennon. That's unfortunate for him. Okay, anyway, Severance. Severance is a book that I have read the first 80-ish pages of before. I lost it. I had to pay the library $40. It was humiliating, and I felt terrible about it. It was this cloud over my life. I knew I wasn't going to be able to find it. I had left it on a ferry, and I had to go into the library and tell them I lost it. They were super nice, of course. Librarians are the best. But that does mean that I kind of half skimmed the first 80 pages of this because I did remember it. I realized that I kind of enjoyed rereading it. I think that I wouldn't enjoy rereading something that I have read all of, but not knowing what happens at the end means that I have forgotten a lot of the beginning, and it was fun to think I know what's coming. I know what's going to come next. This follows a woman named Candace, and she's living in the aftermath of a pandemic. This was written before COVID, so it doesn't feel COVID-ish. Thank fucking God. This pandemic, it's called Shen fever, is kind of zombie-like in the way that it affects people, but it's not transmitted through human interaction. It's transmitted through breathing in fungal spores, not person to person, which I think is really interesting and is not often done in a post-apocalyptic or apocalyptic book about a plague. A great deal of the world, almost all of America, has contracted this disease, and it essentially turns you into a shell of yourself where you are not there behind your eyes, but your body remembers the rituals that it played out in its everyday life. So fevered people will be doing things like going through the motions of having dinner every night. There's not a logic to it, it's just a muscle memory thing. Candace has been taken in by this group of survivors who have been together for longer than she has been with them, and the group has quite you could call it a hierarchical structure, but it's really just one guy who has power over everybody else. But she is lower than everyone else because they don't know her as well, and she's not that interested in getting to know them. But this one guy, Bob, has seen these vulnerable people in a scary situation and known, I can tell them to do whatever I want them to do. I can take the lead here, and no one's going to fight me. And nobody fights him. They all do exactly what he says, and they all kind of live in fear of him and the consequences that he'll enact. He's just this overbearing, controlling presence that thinks that he deserves to be in charge, and no one questions it. And it's very frustrating. They're thinking through every action with the idea in mind of what will Bob do? How will Bob react to this? But that's only half the story, because this goes back and forth between her time in the present, in this apocalyptic world, and her time before the fever really kicked up and started killing everybody in her life in New York City. And I have found that typically in a book that goes back and forth between just different settings, you like one a lot more. And you're kind of waiting for that one and dreading reading the other one. This doesn't have that, because Ling Ma's writing is so skilled and so humorous and so easy to read. It's so digestible that there's never a time where you're wishing something else was happening. Of course, the apocalyptic setting of the present is quite a bit more fast-paced, but it's just the whole thing overall is paced so well that you're not wishing for it while you're reading the parts where she's living in New York City. You're really getting to know the character, and it's interesting because you're spending not all that much time in the present setting. you don't really know the people that she's with in the same way she doesn't know the people that she's with. So as the reader, you're feeling that distance that she's feeling from the rest of the group of survivors. The pre-apocalyptic setting where she's going through the motions of life in New York City have a very anti-capitalist message without being super preachy or irritating about it. Her job is working for this publishing firm, and she is coordinating the production of Bibles. She works in the Bible department, and she's basically using labor in China to create these products. Her job is like the middleman between the people who want to create the product and the people who are doing the work and the labor of creating the product. And it's kind of subtly exploring how much an individual can be at fault for the failures of the larger capitalist system. Like, one of her products is a Bible that comes with gemstones, and it falls through because the people that are creating the gemstones in China don't have safe working conditions, and it is destroying their lungs, grinding down these gemstones. And the people who want the Bible produced, I'm sorry, I literally do not know business terms. The people who want the Bible made tell her, you got to figure it out. You need to find another gemstone producer. And she does, and it goes through, and she does her job, and then that gemstone producer, almost as soon as this Bible has been shipped off, that closes down because of the unsafe working conditions and the workers' lungs. I'm finding this really well written, really easy to read, and I'm liking both of the threads of stories that are happening, and I'm excited to finish it. I think that it will be easy for me to finish the rest of this book tonight, and I'll see you when I do that. Hello, I've finished Severance by Ling. This was a breeze, super easy to read. I'll tell you what happens in the rest of it. So in the post-apocalyptic timeline in this, she's with this group, and they're camping out, making their way across America to get to this facility that this lead guy, Bob, part owns. They just call it the facility, and he makes it out like they're going to make a home there. One of the nights when they're camping out, the group of people that Candace is closest to, which includes Janelle, Ashley, and Evan, all leave to go to walk to Ashley's house, like the home that she grew up in, which is nearby where they're camping. And they do this obviously in secret because Bob is so controlling. They get to Ashley's house, and while they're there, Ashley starts getting into this repetitive loop of trying on clothes, and they realize that she is fevered. So Candace and Evan both run back to camp, and when they get there, Bob is awake waiting for them and knows they have left. The rest of the group all drives back to Ashley's house where Janelle and Ashley still are, and Bob goes inside. There's gunshots. He comes back out without Janelle or Ashley. He tried to shoot Ashley, and Janelle tried to stop him from shooting her, and they both ended up dead. And this creates a lot of tension in the group. Bob is really angry that they've gone against him and the consequences that have occurred because of it. He completely blames them. And Evan totally goes against Candace, like turns on her like that. They drive basically in silence to this facility for the next couple of days, and when they get there, Bob comes over to her and tells her that Evan has told him that she's pregnant. And Bob basically says, this baby is really important to this group. This is like a sign from God, and it's a miracle, and you have shown that you can't be trusted, so we're gonna lock you in. And she is imprisoned in one of the stores in the mall. But he, of course, this like almost cult leader type figure, is making it out like she's the bad guy, and he is doing something for the betterment of both her and the group, always making this out to be her fault. She then contrasts this with her parents' past and with how her mother felt imprisoned when her father told her that they were never going to go back to China, which was very interesting. I think that the way she ties in her past life with the post-apocalyptic timeline is really well done in this. In the other narrative, in New York, she is working through this pandemic. So everybody starts slowly leaving the jobs, working from home, and she stays there till the bitter end. She's the last person left in the office. She's one of the last people left in New York City. And she is essentially fevered. She's repeating these endless, monotonous tasks of doing her job as if she was one of the zombies. This has a very strong, not very subtle anti-capitalist message about like the alienation of labor that's really present in this situation where she is doing her job for no reason. Like, just because she feels like it's what she's supposed to do and it's something to do. Her past ends up catching up with the future tense, and it ends with her escape from this mall. She manages to convince Bob that he can trust her and that it's bad for the baby for her to be locked up in this store stressed out. She ends up overhearing some of the other people in the group tell Bob that they're going to go and grab some more generators and that they need one of the keys for one of the cars. Bob, of course, has all of the keys to everything. And he says, like, leave it outside where I sleep, and I'll get it in the morning. Like, by the time you get back, I'll be asleep, so just leave the keys there. And Candace is like, okay, I'm gonna grab the keys. Do you mind not meowing? So once everybody falls asleep, she goes searching for where she thinks this key has been left, and it's not there. And then Bob runs into her. I hope you can't hear my cat meowing right now. And while she's outside of where he sleeps, which isn't a hot topic, he comes out and she's immediately ready to make up excuses, but she realizes that he is not seeing her. And he starts walking around the mall. And it slowly dawns on her that Bob is now fevered. And so she knocks him over, intending to take all of the keys off of his belt loop. But when she does, she starts beating the shit out of him. She's filled with this rage that she can't contain, and there's blood everywhere and it's horrible. And she takes the keys and she runs. And then she drives to Chicago, and the book kind of ends there. While this is sort of a zombie or pandemic book, it's not full of the violence of a zombie book or the fear that typically surrounds a world-ending pandemic like this. It's mostly around the fear around other people and power. Bob can be scary. He's this really intense and really frustrating character, but she's not that scared of contracting this disease. That's not really anything that's pervasive in the group. They're just surviving, but it's also not really a survival story. This book is really about the horrors of capitalism. It's about immigration, and it's about the search for meaning in a banal existence. And it's also about the pervasive way that the workplace and living in a capitalist society influences you in situations outside of work. In all these different situations, the groups that she's in organize themselves into structures that mimic the workplace, these hierarchical structures. This is saying a lot, and I love the viewpoint that the author is speaking from. I don't think it's necessarily saying anything new, and my main problem with it as someone who is trying to talk about it in a video is that I really have nothing to say about this book, about how I felt about this book. It was fine. It was so middle of the road. I'm almost indifferent towards it. I don't think it was bad, and I think that as a debut, it was really good, especially after just reading Chlorine, which was not a good debut at all. The writing in this is really good. It's full of this humor in these dark situations that I really liked. I just can't imagine ever thinking about this book again. When I said that I was going to read this book, people were commenting that it's their favorite book of all time, and I want to know what you saw in this, because it's not horrible. It's not bad. It is a good book. It's just not anything special to me, and I don't think any part of it was memorable at all. I don't think that the story was memorable. I don't think that the themes it explored were unique or memorable. It just was. It just was what it was, and I really have nothing more to say about that. This didn't make me feel anything, and I'm thinking that that might partly be because I just finished reading The Shards, which made me feel every emotion so strongly that I had to become numb after reading it. It forced me into a fugue state, so the next couple books I read, I might just not react to at all. That might just be a product of reading that book before I read this one, but I'm sorry. I have truly nothing more to say about this. It was fine. It was all right. No complaints, no praise. The next book I'm reading is You Will Love What You Have Killed by Kevin Lambert, and I would like to say that I'm 20 pages into it because that's what the page number says, but this book does start on page 10. So I'm really not very far into it at all, and I don't know how I'm going to feel about it. It seems like it's a little bit stream of consciousness, which is definitely not my favorite style of writing. I just find it hard to follow and a little bit tedious, but I'm committed to reading this because this is supposed to be an actual horror book, like I'm claiming this video to be, whereas Severance, the book I started with, was truly not a horror book at all. It doesn't claim to be a horror book. No one has ever said it's a horror book. It's a dystopian book, which I'm just throwing in there. I'm acting like it's a subgenre. I don't care. Maybe I am the arbiter of genres. So far, this seems to be about children in Quebec. That's all I got for you. I will update you when I'm a little bit farther through it. Hello, I've had a mild change of heart about Severance and I want to talk about it. Most of what I said still holds true, but I've changed my mind about what I think about the ending after thinking about it for so long because I just wanted to know what everybody liked about this book so much. I have not been able to get it out of my head, not because the story was memorable, but because people really like it and I want to know why. I want to be there with y'all. So after she escapes the mall, she drives to Chicago, and she starts, as she's driving, to get really nostalgic about this place because her ex-boyfriend had lived there and talked about it a lot, and also because she realizes that her family had gone on a trip there when she was quite young, and she's getting these memories, and she's just feeling almost at home there. And we know that fevered people's symptoms don't always appear until they're in a place that they recognize. That's what had happened to Ashley, who didn't have any symptoms until she was in her childhood home, and that's what had happened to Bob, who also didn't have any symptoms until he was back in a place where he spent a lot of time when he was a kid, at this mall. Eventually, when driving into Chicago, the traffic is so jammed, all these abandoned cars, that she can't get any further in her car, and it ends with the line, "I get out and I start walking." And something that she did when she moved to New York was walk for hours and hours and hours a day. So it's pretty clear to me now, and I don't know how I didn't see it in the moment, that she ends the book fevered, and her symptoms start appearing once she gets to this place that she has some memories attached to. And I think that's cool. I think it's a cool ending, and it's a little bit changed how I think about the book. I like that it was not overly clear. The way I'm describing it to you, it might seem like it's really, really, really clear that she's fevered. Maybe it was to everybody else, but it wasn't to me, and I think that it was clever. That's all I have to say about that. Now that I've figured that out, I think I'm going to forget about Severance for the rest of my life. I have finished You Will Love What You Have Killed by Kevin Lambert, and I also don't think I'll ever think about this again. 2 flops. This one, much more so. Severance wasn't a flop. It just wasn't anything. It was just, I'm just so neutral on it. I just have nothing to say. This, I hated. I did not like this at all. I shouldn't have finished it. I knew I wasn't going to like it from the first, 2 chapters, and that was true. Why don't I just listen to myself? I'm so stubborn about finishing books, especially when they're that short. So this book follows our narrator through his childhood and teenage years, but it's not a linear story. It's very fragmented. There's not really, a narrative to this. It's kind of just bits and pieces, and it's mainly centered around when horror's just the author thinking, how can I be as taboo and gruesome as possible, and it's boring. You put all of these really, really intriguing and awful things into your book, and you somehow made it so boring. This is really about a place in Quebec. It's the author's hometown, and it's about the violence in this place, particularly violence towards children. Children die in this book a lot in a series of murders and accidents. The first one is the narrator's friend Sylvie, who is hiding in a pile of snow when the snowblower comes, and the big machine snowblower, not a guy with a backpack. It essentially pulverizes her. There's another kid who is tipping back in his chair, and he falls headfirst onto a pencil. What's kind of interesting is that the man who's driving the snowplow is a character named Kevin Lambert, which is the author's name, and I thought that was cool at first, but as I read the book, I just realized it was another way that this author was trying to be an edgelord in a really shallow way with nothing behind it. He's just cringe. The narrator's mom, who had been babysitting this little girl Sylvie since she was very young, is distraught by her death and ends up killing herself. And other than moving to his grandparents' house, this doesn't really seem to affect the narrator in any way. The narrator is very much disaffected and distanced from the reader, partly because of the fragmentation of the story, but also partly because the writing, it doesn't really have anything to do with emotions, and it's not very evocative. The character Kevin ends up having a son with the mother who dies during childbirth, so he's single parenting this kid, and when the kid's 2, he takes him to the zoo, and he stands him up on the ledge overlooking the cougar's cage, and a voice in his head tells him to just give the kid a little shove. And he watches as he falls to his death, and then, I think he survives the fall, and then he gets eaten by cougars. And at the zoo that day, where this incident happens, is the family of one of the narrator's school friends named Sebastian, and we learn that Sebastian, a few months after this incident, his entire family is killed by the father, who has a brain tumor. All of these children who are dead come back as ghosts to live their lives, and it's very much unclear whether or not they have an effect on their environment and who can see them, or if they actually did die, or if it was just something that this narrator made up in his weird little disturbed head. The narrator is gay and ends up as a child having a relationship with Kevin, who is fully twice his age, a full-grown adult. It's very gross, and it again is saying nothing. It might be trying to say that people become gay when horrible things happen to them as a kid, which is insane. The narrator also has a relationship with a kid in his class, and his dad hates this and ends up taking him to the strip club a bunch of times, trying to convert him. Once the narrator and the kid in his class break up, they're both very distraught by this, and the narrator wants to drive to his house and prove to the kid that the kid still loves him. And while he's doing that, he sees him on his bike on the road, and he runs him over and kills him. And that is the only kid who doesn't come back from the dead. The book closes with all of these wronged children committing this mass domestic terrorism plot where they blow up the town. I am honestly making it sound more interesting than it was. It was a drag. It was only 180 pages, and I felt every single page of it. This is, I think, the least likable kind of horror book, where it's just lame. Like, the horrible things happen just to happen, not to say anything or do anything, and there's also no sense of tension or dread. It's just like you're supposed to be sickened by the content. And then the writing is so blunt and disaffected that you don't even really feel anything. I didn't care about any of these characters. Right off the bat, I thought that I would DNF this because of the blatant transphobia. It treats this woman in it, truly just tells her story through the violence and discrimination that she faces without really condemning it. I think that it is trying to be empathetic, but it's a very outdated and uncritical lens that it is viewing it from, and it was uncomfortable and not really in a way that was saying anything about transphobia. This was also deeply and violently ableist, and that was not in a way that was anything other than ill-intentioned, and totally pervasive through the book. Endless descriptions, all of which are horrifically violent and disgusting and awful. Again, it's trying to be provocative. It's not doing anything with that. It was boring and stupid and corny, and I hated it. I'm planning to read My Annihilation next. I don't like this cover that has the big circular hole in it, because when you hold a book, that's where your hands go. But I'm trying not to let that dissuade me. I have a feeling that this will be a little bit more interesting, but I have read 3 pages of it, so I can't really tell you anything yet. I'll see you when I can. I've finished My Annihilation. I read it really quickly. It took me like a day. It's very easy to read, but it is a little bit complex, and the way I'm explaining it is going to make it sound more complex than it is. It's pretty easy to follow when you're reading the book. This starts with a man in a mountain lodge, and he's in this room, and we know that he is stealing another man named Kazuka's identity. And Kazuka has left a letter, this sort of confessional, where in the letter he admits to pushing his sister off of a cliff because he had brought her up to the cliff and then became so overwhelmed with this anxiety that she would go up there on her own and fall off. The only way to relieve himself of this was to make that happen. She does survive, but this kicks off a whole bunch of things in his life, and him and his mom end up moving away. It's his stepsister. They end up moving away. And there's then a violent incident where he kind of attacks his mom and he gets sent to a treatment facility. Then it switches back to the man in the lodge, and the man's kind of like, oh my god, whose identity did I steal? Like, this isn't good. Someone knocks at his door and says, this place is bugged. We gotta get out of here. And this man follows him to the car, and when he gets into the car and puts a seatbelt on, the seatbelt locks into place. The man ends up taking him to a hospital where he says, if you're really not Kazuka like you claim that you're actually not, they'll be able to prove that with DNA at the hospital. They get to the hospital and the doctor is like, I know that you're not Kazuka. He takes him into a room where a man is sitting there just kind of blank-faced, staring off into nothing. And in this room, he throws a piece of paper onto the ground, and the man struggles against it, but seems to be unable to not go and pick up the paper off the ground. And the doctor tells him, this is the real Kazuka. Then it kind of goes back in the narrator's life. He's telling his story to the doctor, and we learn that he used to be a physician, and he had this patient named Yukari who he ended up falling in love with. This man was like a psychoanalyst or something, and when Yukari was under hypnosis doing one of his treatments with him, she indicated that her previous physician, whose practice she left to come to him, had assaulted her. He ends up implanting memories, telling her that this didn't happen while she's under hypnosis, and implanting memories of him and her having some sort of relationship. The narrator tracks this doctor down, Yoshimi, and learns that Yoshimi basically did the exact same thing that he did. That they never actually had anything happen between the two of them. Yoshimi just implanted memories into her because he wanted her. It's really gross from both of them. The narrator and Yukari end up in a relationship, and we learn that she has a really, really, really horrible past where basically every awful thing that could happen to someone has happened to her. And she is seeking this treatment out from the previous doctor and from the narrator for her depression and her suicidal thoughts. He tries to treat her with hypnosis, and he tries changing her memories, and it just doesn't end up working. So she asks for electroshock therapy, which they do a few times until he overdoes it and he wipes all of her memories, and she completely forgets him. She ends up falling in love with someone else because she has no memories with this narrator, and the narrator is devastated by this. Of course, he is obsessed with her and in love with her in a really sick and twisted way, and he can't handle the fact that she has left him, but he also wants the best for her, so he doesn't pursue it, but he's completely distraught by this. Then some of the men from her horrible past show up, and they show her a video of her in her past, and it brings back all of these memories of all of her trauma, and she ends up ending her life because she remembers everything. The narrator needs revenge, so he ends up going and finding that Dr. Yoshimi, who he thinks is corrupt enough to turn him into the kind of person who can enact revenge on these two men who have caused the death of the love of his life. And the doctor says, yeah, I can do that. And he puts him under hypnosis, and the narrator is recording the entire hypnosis session on this device. And the doctor says, don't you remember the first time we met when you were at that treatment facility after you had hurt your mom and pushed your sister off a cliff? This is Kazuka. He has not stolen his identity. He just thinks that he has for some reason. This has always been him. The narrator and the person who was writing those letters are the same person. The narrator, like the present tense, doesn't remember this. We're learning all of this through the letters that he wrote before he lost his memory. And in those letters, we learn that he is not actually trying to kill these two men who caused the death of his ex-girlfriend. He wants them to feel his pain. So he manages to manipulate them and trick them into coming to his clinic, and he drugs them, and then he gives them electroshock therapy, trying to erase all of their memories and implant his own life into their heads so they can feel how much it hurts to be without the love of their life. One of the men, Kita, this fails to work on him, and he's erased all of Kita's memories, but he has been able to make one thing stick, and that is to pick up a piece of paper if you see it on the ground. So that man that the narrator saw in the beginning is actually Kita, one of the men who caused the death of this girlfriend, Yukari. So he tries again with the second man, and it doesn't quite work with him either. Instead of completely adopting Kazuka's memories, he becomes convinced that he has stolen Kazuka's identity. This is our narrator. The actual, real, original Kazuka is the doctor at the clinic, and it ends up switching to his perspective, and he decides that the older doctor, Yoshimi, is responsible for all of this. He thinks that Yoshimi didn't really treat him when he was a kid at the treatment center, that he just experimented on him and manipulated his mind to see the lengths that he could go to in messing with a human brain. And he also decides that Yoshimi indirectly led the two men to find Yukari and caused her death, essentially. So he kidnaps Yoshimi, he brings him to the clinic, and he kills him. The book ends with the doctor, the real Kazuka, electrocuting himself, trying to erase his own memory and having written a letter of a different life. So he's hoping to have no memory, wake up, read this letter, and adopt this life as his own, adopt these memories as his own. If you can't tell, if you're into psychology, this book will be so fucking frustrating for you because it's just not based in anything real, and it treats itself like this is reality, like brainwashing is possible to this extent, like you can do these kinds of things to a human brain. It's absolutely based in like pseudoscience and myths, and it's ridiculous in that way, but if you can get past this, it's a fun book. Like, it's a romp. You just have to be able to enjoy it for what it is, which is silly and absolutely not based in science. I think that if this had sold itself as like a science fiction book, it might have been a little bit better. I think that the premise is really interesting, where it's so complex and you don't know who is who and what is the truth, and all like the nature of memory is explored in an interesting way. But because it seems to pretend to be based in reality and uses facts that are not like real or can easily be disproven, it can be a little bit silly. If you are a psychology major, you will hate this. But the storytelling is very fun, and I was able to look past it. I think that this is the best Japanese to English translation that I've ever read. It is a hard language to translate into English, and it always is a little bit stilted, and the language is often very simplistic. This definitely had those elements, but it wasn't as distracting as it has been in other Japanese English translations that I've read. I thought that it was done really well. I liked the complexity of the story, and I liked the unfolding nature of the narrative. I think it was fun. I think it was a fun book. I liked all the twists and the turns, and I enjoyed my time with it. Next up, I'm reading Bunny by Mona Awad. I'm less than 20 pages in, so I can't really tell you what it's about yet, but so far I'm loving the writing. So far, the writing and the story are both really compelling. This is about a grad student and doing an MFA in, I think, fiction writing, and there's a group of women who are in her program who almost act like children. It's very Mean Girls. They are like obsessed with each other. They call each other Bunny, and she is very left out of this, and she's definitely looks down on them and judges them, but also wants to be part of the in-group. And it's a small enough program that there's a class where it's these four women and then the narrator, and it's like basically them against her because she's just not part of the group. And they invite her to their smut salon, which is some sort of drinking party. I have no idea what it is. That's as far as I've gotten. She's been outside of this group, and now she's received an invitation. She doesn't know if it's a joke or not. I feel like the characters in this are going to be really, really interesting, and I'm super excited to read more. There's 3 parts, So I've told myself that I'm going to try to update you after I'm done each part so that I don't have to tell you the entire story all in one sitting like I just did with my annihilation, because that's so much for my brain to remember. So hopefully I'll see you when I'm at the end of part 1. I'm up to part 1 and I'm here to update you about Bunny. Last I left you, she had been invited to the Bunny's smut salon. She ends up going to this party, ditching her best friend Ava, and she gets really drunk. And this party, this smut salon, is just them doing erotic readings of things. She doesn't know this, so she obviously hasn't brought anything with her, and they're like, you got to tell us a story. So she kind of makes up a story about this boy that she had a crush on in high school that she did a play with named Rob Valencia. She gets plastered. The bunnies make sure that she always has a drink in her hand, and at the end of the night they tell her to go outside and catch a rabbit, and she says, obviously I'm not going to be able to catch a rabbit, and they're like, no, it's a lot easier than you think. She goes outside. She's really, really, really drunk, and a rabbit jumps into her lap, and she's like, that must not have happened. That can't have been real when she wakes up the next morning. After she goes to this party, while they're at school, the bunnies are a lot friendlier to her, but they're still so incredibly fake. Like, they'll say, I really like your dress, when she's not wearing a dress. It's very unsettling, and this really contrasts against her best friend Ava's sort of unapologetic realness, where Ava seems like one of those people who's like, I'm brutally honest, but she's just being like using it as an excuse to be rude. Ava is someone who says everything that the main character Samantha thinks. Everything that she wants to say, Ava will say it unapologetically, and she comes across as quite mean and angry, but you also appreciate her realness, her living her truth. After Samantha goes to this party, Ava ignores her for 2 full weeks, and she is very, very distressed about this because they're super close. Like, they were living together in Ava's apartment, and Samantha has to go back to living at her old place. Also, after this party, rabbits start following her around campus and freaking her out. One day, one of the bunnies texts her and says, we're having a party, and she uses like the salsa dancing emoji, and this makes Samantha realize that that night she'll be able to find Ava at this salsa class that they go to together. And Ava's there and completely ignores her, and it leads up to this confrontation after the salsa dancing class, where Samantha's like, are you mad at me for going to that party? And Ava's like, no, I don't care. I don't care what you do. And that really upsets Samantha. Like, it feels like Ava is telling her, I don't care about you. And Samantha runs off, and Ava's calling after her to come back, and Samantha ends up going to the party that she's been invited to by the bunnies. She gets to the party, and she lets them dress her up and do her hair, and they say, we have a surprise for you. So she is left with the 4 men that are at the party, and these men very much are not human beings. They're talking to her in a very like stilted and rehearsed way. The 4 bunnies have gone upstairs, and they are screaming up there. She can hear them screaming, and the men are like, we don't hear any screaming. What are you talking about? They say, here? She says, do you hear that screaming? They say, here? Like, they're very, very strange. The bunnies come back down, and they say, the surprise will be here any second. And then there's a knock at the door, and they say, oh, Samantha, go get that. And she does. And at the door is Rob Valencia, the guy from high school. And he's wearing the same outfits as all of the other men, and the whole time he's talking in a very similar way, and he's speaking as we, and using us. Like, I guess the royal we, but it becomes clear that this is the bunnies talking through him. But she's not in her right mind. She's drunk, and she's upset about Ava, and she just kind of lets this happen. She lets herself be whisked away on this teenage dream of falling in love with Rob Valencia and him wanting her back. And they're all dancing, and she looks around, and she notices that all of the men have been paired off with the women, and all of the men are chewing on parts of the women's like outfits, like on a spaghetti strap or a string of pearls. And she looks down, and Rob Valencia has started chewing on her corsage, and she tells him to stop, and he doesn't, so she slaps him, and he blows up because of this. He starts yelling at her and criticizing her, and he's using the same language that the bunnies have used criticizing her work in their workshop class. He's basically rambling at her and tearing her to shreds. He says, we tried to braid your hair, you didn't let us braid it. We invited you to things, you wouldn't come. We asked you to come out for bento boxes, and you said, no, I'm too busy and important and better than you are for bento boxes. But you don't remember. All you remember is Samantha Heather Mackey is the victim. Samantha Heather Mackey is in pain. Samantha Heather Mackey's heart is on fire with all the feelings she thinks only she can feel. Clearly, it's the bunnies talking through him. And a lot of these criticisms do ring true. Like, he's talking about how she thinks she's too good for them, and she looks down on everybody, and that is definitely something that she's doing. He gets more and more worked up until his head literally explodes, quite gruesomely. And essentially, that's the end of the chapter, and she wakes up the next morning in a complete daze. This head exploding causes her to totally lose her mind, and that is compounded by the fact that the bunnies keep giving her pills like to take the edge off, so she really is like not at all there. She's somewhere else watching herself do things, and she can't like really form sentences properly, and she's almost acting like quite childlike in the way that she's understanding what's going on around her. And this new state of mind that she's in, coupled with the fact that she's lost her best friend Ava, has put her in a very vulnerable and, again, childlike position, and the bunnies completely take her in, and she becomes one of them. And the dynamic between all of them is quite different now. It now seems like the bunnies are being quite a bit less fake with her, that they really have accepted her as one of them. They end up inviting her to one of their workshops, which takes place in one of the bunnies, Kira's attic. And in Kira's attic, they start performing this ritual. They basically tell Samantha to sit in the corner and be quiet and watch. They chant, they hold hands, there's an axe, and there's a rabbit. And the ritual causes this rabbit to explode into like a pink mist. And then a man knocks at the door. They're turning men into rabbits. And the man comes in and it doesn't work. The transformation has not quite been perfect, and that's the workshop part of this. When they realize that he's not quite right, they kill him, and then they all sit together in a circle and talk about what went wrong as if it's a piece of writing, like as if they're in class. And then they make another boy, and then they make another boy, and then they make another boy, till they finally find one that they like. And that's where I'm at. It's very weird. It's quite gruesome, but not really, because it feels very fake. It's just very far removed from reality, so it doesn't feel awful to read necessarily. The best part about this so far is the character dynamics. I think all of the characters are really vivid and like quite over the top in a very fun way, and I'm having a lot of fun like exploring the dynamics between all of them and like what's going on in Samantha's head. And part of me thinks that she's just imagined Ava, and Ava's not a real person, because it really does seem like Ava is this figure who says everything that Samantha wishes she was brave enough to say. And so I'm excited to see what happens with that. I think that this is really fucking weird, and I love it. I finished Bunny by Mona Awad. Let's talk about what happens. We start part 2 with a voice change, which I love. She starts talking from the we perspective, and she's totally immersed in the bunny's world. She's been 100% adopted by them, and she speaks like one of them. She says things like, "My teacher said some not so nice things," and it's insufferably annoying and done perfectly. For weeks, she is a bunny, until one day she's walking down the street with the bunnies, and Ava pulls her into an alley, and Ava's like, "What the fuck happened? Where have you been? I've been looking everywhere for you." And she's like, "I'm scared. Who are you?" And Ava's like, "Look at me, look at me, look at me." And it suddenly switches back to first person, like I pronouns. Amazing. I love a voice change. I love how this book did it. Samantha finds that familiarity with Ava, and she follows her to a diner, and Ava is trying to like coach her back into being herself again and being like a real human being and not this like weird caricature. And the bunnies catch her there at the diner with Ava, and Eleanor, the like lead bunny, the queen bee, is very upset with this, and they end up leaving her there. And she knows she's messed up by talking to anyone other than a bunny, and she gets a text saying, "We need to talk." So she goes over to Eleanor's house. Before she goes inside, she sees this beautiful, haunting stag on the front lawn, and they just stare at each other and have a moment. And then she goes inside, expecting that the "we need to talk" is her being kicked out of this group. But it's not. They say, "It's finally time for you to lead workshop, for you to become one of us." And it quickly becomes clear that this is not an act of kindness. This is a test to see if she is able to turn a bunny into a man. And it doesn't work. The bunny does not explode. No man appears. The bunny just runs off. And then Victoria, one of the bunnies, goes, "I'm leaving. Like, this is boring." And she goes outside and she says, "Come here, come here, come here." And they all go outside, and there is a man there at the bus stop, and he's like got headphones on, and he's like dark and brooding. And it's unclear whether or not this man was created during the workshop by Samantha, or if he's like literally just a normal dude who's just there. But the bunnies decide that he's not real, and Samantha is booted from the group. And it's back to that super fakeness, this meanness hidden behind a sort of sweet exterior. And she's totally an outsider in a way that's even worse than it was before. Winter break happens, and she ends up falling into this deep depression, and she's trying to find Ava, but she can't remember where Ava's house is. Then she's in the grocery store, and she sees that boy that she might have made or might not have made, and as she's about to follow him, her teacher interrupts her and like senses her loneliness and her depression and how she has nowhere to go for the holidays and invites her to like a student staff party that she's throwing at her house. Samantha behaves really weirdly at this party and is super off-putting to everyone, and while she's there she notices that there's a boy in a catering uniform that has the same sort of deformities and mix-ups that happen when you create a boy out of a bunny. Like, his lips are a little bit wrong and his hands are in gloves because they still haven't figured out how to make hands properly, and she knows that this is one of the bunnies and it really freaks her out. She leaves the party on the bus and she's just thinking to herself, and then all of a sudden from behind her someone is finishing her thoughts out loud, and it's that boy from before. She follows him off the bus and he leads her to Ava's house. And once they're there, he disappears and she goes in and Ava welcomes her back in and is so happy to see her, and slowly she becomes herself again. Her and Ava fall back into their old dynamic and she starts writing again, which she hasn't been doing for months. And then one day she hears a noise upstairs and she's super freaked out. She's like, Ava, what was that? And Ava's like, oh, it's probably just Max. He's like been a lodger here. He's renting out the spare room. And then she says, speak of the devil, and who appears from the staircase but the boy from the bus, the boy that she might have created out of a bunny. It becomes clear that Ava and Max are dating, and the three of them have dinner together. Max makes them rabbit, and at dinner Ava says, oh, Samantha's a writer, and Max says, what do you write about? And Ava says, oh, she's so secretive about it, like she's not gonna tell you. She sits there with her hand covering it, and Max says, well, that's because she writes about you. And Samantha is immediately like bright red because this is true. She does write about Ava. And Max says to Ava, like, if I were her, if I were a writer, I would also be writing about you. And she's like, yeah, what would you write? And he starts quoting things that Samantha has written about Ava. Later on, she ends up sneaking into his room and she finds written in a notebook all of the emails and passwords of all of the people that are important in the story. Her, the bunnies, and their teachers. She also finds his phone there, and it has texts from all of the bunnies, like begging him for attention. And then he appears in front of her and he says, oh, I accidentally picked up your phone and you gotta go. There's like an emergency meeting that your prof is calling. She gets to the meeting and she's the first there, and then each of the bunnies comes separately, which has never happened before. They are so fucking tight-knit, and there's obvious tension between them, and as the meeting progresses it becomes clear that these four women hate each other now. They each read a piece of work that is about Max, and they're calling each other sluts, at first under their breath and then fully out loud, and it's obvious that Max has torn them apart. Then a bit later she gets an email from her advisor who's been worried about whether or not she's going to graduate, and she goes to this meeting and it's the advisor and her professor, but it's very poorly made simulacrums of them, obviously done by the bunnies. They taunt her and then they tell her that they've left her a surprise at her house. So she rushes back home, and in the floor of Ava's living room is a dead swan. Throughout the book, she's constantly been comparing Ava's hair to white feathers, and it's obvious now that Ava was something that Samantha had created out of a swan. And this is Ava's, essentially her dead body in the middle of the living room. Max, who was in love with Ava, needs to get revenge for this, and they both know that it was Eleanor who killed Ava. So Max grabs the axe that killed the swan and hurries off to Eleanor's house. Samantha follows behind him, and when they get there she says, you can't do this. Takes the axe from him, and then she sees in the window all of the bunnies in there wearing Ava's clothes. And she's like, oh, actually I am gonna kill them. So she goes inside, but she can't bring herself to do it. And they are just kind of mocking her in their weird mean girl way. And then they see Max. He comes in behind her and they're all obsessed with him. So they chase him outside, and then Samantha ends up hitting Max with the axe, and he turns back into a stag and he kicks the bunnies and like breaks all their limbs and then hits them with his antlers and then runs off. The book ends with their graduation from this program. The bunnies are in casts and on crutches, and they don't really interact with Samantha. I've heard that some people read this book as Samantha being schizophrenic, but I think that it's more fun to take everything at face value with this. I think that it's more interesting to think of the like actual tangible effect that these creations or like conjurations that she's made from animals have had on the world. Like, all of the bunnies saw Max. Ava interacted with the world. I just think it's more fun for this to be taken literally. I understand why other people have found it grating, but I kind of liked the insufferable nature of the main character. She just kind of whines, and she's irritating, and she never like really looks inward, and she really is so committed to being an outsider, especially in this school of like elite rich kids. but then she relates so much more to the students, like to her peers, than she does to the poverty around her in the city. It's like she wants to be an outsider, but not in the way that actual othered people are outsiders. I don't think that you're necessarily meant to like Samantha, and I think it's really fun to have an unreliable narrator. This is in a lot of ways a critique of like elite art schools, but also the heart of the book is really a metaphor for creative writing, which was fun. I think that the writing itself was really good. It was very cinematic and very sensory. There's nothing like overly special about this book to me. I think it was just like a pretty good book. I've seen people either love it or hate it, and that's it. There is absolutely no in between. I thought this was fine. Some parts of it were boring to me a little bit. Like I felt like it kind of dragged near the end. And though I do think now that you aren't supposed to like Samantha's I'm not like other girls personality, at times it almost felt like the message was women are mean. I guess it could be a little bit reductive in that way, but I don't know. I think there's a lot more analysis to be had of this book that I'm just a little bit too lazy for. It was fun. It's not nearly as like disturbing or strange as people make it out to be. I know I read a lot of weird books, so that might be why I'm saying that. It is weird. It's not that weird. A lot of middling reviews for all of these books. A lot of like, they were okay. I didn't read anything super, super special in this video. I again think that that's because I just finished a book that has taken up all of the space that I had in my brain to think about books. The shards messed me up, and even like a week later, I still feel like that's the world that I'm inhabiting, and I'm having a hard time like really getting into other books. So that is like, take everything I say with a grain of salt, because this is really influenced by what I've just finished reading. That's the end of the video. I think that this was probably my favorite, but max of 4 stars. My least favorite was You Will Love What You've Killed, because that book fucking sucked. The next video I'm planning on doing is reading books with characters that are awful, so let me know if you have some suggestions for that. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.